Hello, this is Nicholas Pellegrino from asileFX, and I'd like to welcome you to the first tutorial of the visual effects series. And this tutorial is Pyrotechnics. And what we'll be doing is blowing up a planet, and I'll be working you through each step as we go from modeler into layout, working with volumetrics and particle effects. Okay, gonna get started by creating a ball. And so create and select ball, or shift and 0, or sorry, shift and the O key. And we're going to start out, I'm using the middle mouse button to constrain to make sure that it's equal on all sides, or you can hold down the control key and you can also get the same effect. I'm going to hit N on the keyboard to pull up our numeric. And when you're blowing up a sphere-like object, you're going to want to set this to tessellation. And we're going to change our segments up to 8. And that should give us enough geometry to work with, and not having too little so it looks polygonal, or too much so the scene will be difficult to calculate. And I'm just going to hit the spacebar to end that tool. And now we have our basic shape for the planet already. But the main part is how we section it up to be blown up. And I'm going to hit Q on the keyboard right away just to give it our surface name. And we're going to call it planet. Click OK. And now in the next layer, we're also going to need to create another ball. And I'm going to hit N on the keyboard again, and this time its segments, I'm going to bring it down to 6, making sure it's still a tessellation, because this is going to be part of our cutting tool, or actually is going to be our cutting tool, that we're going to use to break up the planet into sections for exploding. And now I'm going to use the magnet tool because we need to drag this out so that it's not a perfect sphere. And in order to use the magnet tool, you gotta use shift and the colon. And then what we're gonna go ahead and do is right mouse click and drag out this area only on one axis. And then what we can do is just start pulling out sections. And then right mouse click on that center crosshair, and you can move the area of influence around. And we'll move it around down here. And what we just want to do is just kind of get rid of that sphere shape and just do kind of a unique looking cutting tool. I'm going to hit spacebar and then shift and colon again, and this time right mouse click in the right viewport, and we could start dragging it out on that view. And I want to mention right now that we're not doing this in proportion, just because this is really going to be the only thing in our scene, and it'll actually be easier to calculate, or not so much calculate, but to texture and to set up the dynamics and all that if we're working with sort of a smaller object. And that's one of the main reasons I'm keeping it down, or as you can see right here, at 500 millimeters as far as the grid. And this object itself is only a few meters long. But I like to keep it that way just so when we're in layout, which I'll show you later, it'll be a lot easier to calculate everything. Alright, I'm actually going to go ahead and undo. Shift and colon again, and right mouse click, and kind of pull out that area a little right there. And this is also a good technique to create an asteroid. We kind of have a perfect asteroid right now, if you want to animate that for anything, but we're going to be using it as our cutting tool. And before we start doing our Boolean subtractions, I want to give this a surface name. So Q on the keyboard, and I'm just going to call it cut. And what I also want to do is vary it just a little bit, because right now we still have a lot of smooth sections. It's not as rigid as I like it to be. So I'm going to hit Shift and J, and that's going to bring up our Jitter Tool. And what that's going to do is kind of jitter the points randomly. I'm going to set that type to normal, and our range, we're just going to set that to 0.1, which is 100 millimeters. And as you can see, that made it so it's a lot more jagged. I'll undo that so you can see it, but it's a lot more jagged now and looks a lot better. And that way it's just we're not getting smooth cuts, because this is going to be an explosion and we don't want to have smooth surfaces. I also want to make another note. The reason we're doing this with tessellated spheres is because we want to make sure that all of these points, or all of these polygons, are 3-point polygons. And the reason for that is when we're using our cutting tool and we're booleaning out the sections for each part of the planet, when we have 4-point polys, we'll get a little bit of, we'll hit some non-planar polys, and which means we'll have display errors. And if we're using 3-point polygons, we won't have to worry about display errors because there's no way to make a 3-point polygon non-planar. And if you don't know what non-planar is, it's pretty much when the points, I'll just create a box really quick in another layer. This won't be part of it, just to show you what a non-planar polygon is. It's just pretty much when the points have no way of calculating that polygon, and unless you split it, because right now a whole point of a polygon is a flat surface, and this of course cannot be a flat surface, and we're already getting a little bit of display errors in there. But if I was to edit this point and bring it down and just kind of overlap them, you can see there's a lot of errors in there and you won't be able to see the polygons correctly. But if we were to triple that, of course the way these are facing, so I'll flip it, and you can see the polygons in there a little bit better. Of course the way these are facing, like I was saying, it's a little more difficult, but they do show up, and if we untripled them, they wouldn't exactly always show up. And a non-planar polygon is just pretty much a non-flat polygon, and by sticking with 3-point polys, we don't have to worry about them disappearing like it just did right now. As you can see, I'm pulling that point down and it just disappeared. Alright, so I'll just delete that and go back to our object. We've defined our surface names, and before we go ahead and start cutting, I just want to make it obvious which surface is which. So I'm going to pull up the surface editor, which is Control F3 for me. Typical Lightwave 8 default is F5, or you can go and just select surface editor from up here. And the cut we're going to make blue, just a bright blue, and the planet we're going to set to a bright red. And that's just so we can see exactly what's going on. Of course, we won't be leaving these colors for the actual animation, but just right now to see what we're working with and to see where the cuts are at, it's good to keep them separate. Alright, and before we start creating our pieces, I'm going to go ahead and hit C on the keyboard, or Control C, just to copy the planet that we already have. I'm going to hit this little arrow key up next to the name of our object, and I'm just going to paste it in our last layer. And that's just because I want to have a version of the planet that's not cut up so that we can use it for object replacement in layout, and I'll show you that. And that's just pretty much to fix some smoothing issues and shadow issues that we're going to have, which I'll show you once we get everything into layout and ready to start animating. Okay, now what I need to do is start positioning this cutting tool into areas of the planet, and each part of the intersection is going to be a piece, and we're going to have to do 2 booleans to make this piece. And we're going to start out just by pulling it in just a little right here and starting with this cut. So I'm going to hit, or go ahead first and make it so the foreground object is in the background and vice versa. And you can also do that by hitting the quotation key, which will swap you back and forth between the two layers. And we want to make sure we have this cutting tool in the background. And I'm going to hit Shift B on the keyboard for the Boolean. And first thing we're going to select is intersect. and I'm going to hit OK. And as you can see, that cut out our piece, but we lost our planet. So what we're going to need to do is hit C on the keyboard, or Control C. We just want to copy everything in the foreground layer that we have left, and I'm going to hit undo, and then Shift B again for Boolean, and this time I'm going to hit subtract. And now we have our planet cut out, and I'll go to a new layer, which I'll just start out by skipping a layer just so we know which layers are which, and I'm going to hit paste, which is V or Control V depending on your keyboard layout. And now as you can see, we have a cut piece, and when we put them together, they match up perfectly. And what we're actually going to be doing is going ahead and breaking down each one of these sections into smaller pieces and having them explode at different times. But right now we want to set up all our major cuts. So I'm going to go down here and rotate, and you just want to change up your cutting tool just a little bit so it's not exactly the same cut all around. And that looks like it'll be a good one, so we can swap that again by hitting the quotation key, and then Shift B again, and we're going to turn intersect, and then copy that, undo, Shift B again, subtract, go to a new layer, and actually this time I'm going to skip 2 layers and hit paste, and that's just so when I break up this other object, we'll have open spaces for the objects that come out of it, and when we're in layout, it won't be so confusing of which objects are which. Okay, now we have 2 cuts out of here, and I can show that they match up really well still. We can select our cutting tool layer again, and using T to move and Y to rotate, and we're just going to reposition that. Actually, we'll move it towards the back over here, and we'll make this a big piece, kind of a large chunk coming out of it. And I'll hit the quotation key again, and Shift B, and select intersect. I'm going to copy, undo, Shift B again, and set it to subtract to cut that piece out. And now we're going to bring it actually onto the next layer set and hit paste. And that's just so we're keeping everything nice and separate from each other, because that one's going to be broken up into several pieces, this big cut we just made. Alright, and now we'll set our cutting tool again. And pretty much we're just going to go out throughout the whole model and just kind of break it down into these large sections. And when we're animating, what we're going to have is a large section break off, and then that large section break off into smaller pieces. And that's just going to give a lot more variation and a lot more realism to the explosion, and it'll give it a pretty neat effect. Alright, so now we have our cutting tool set up. So I'm going to go ahead and swap that again using the quotation key, Shift B on the keyboard, select intersect. Make sure we have everything cut well with no pieces jutting off. 'Cause sometimes when you're doing booleans, especially with the tessellations, the tessellated sphere, sometimes you'll get some artifacts shooting off. But when you're cutting just a sphere, you shouldn't really have any problems with that. So we're going to copy that, undo it, and then subtract. Alright, and we'll swap to our next, or switch that to our next layer set, and paste that. And actually before we continue, I'm going to take this planet layer that we have, cut it, and actually put it in the 3rd layer. Since we have our cut planet, our cutting tool, and our full planet, and we'll keep those together, and that way we can still span off with our other pieces that we're creating. And so far it's cut up pretty well. I'm gonna do a few more. Just move that. T to move, Y to rotate. Just bringing our pieces in here. We're gonna swap that again. And now Boolean intersect. Hit C on the keyboard, or Control C to copy. Undo. Control B, or sorry, Shift B for Boolean again, and this time subtract. Move down to our next layer set, and we'll see how big that other piece is. And we can break that up into 3, so we'll go ahead and paste that on that 4th layer. Alright. Okay, and we're getting kind of a apple coring effect here. It's starting to look pretty neat. And we'll go back to our cutting tool layer. And T to move and Y to rotate. And we're just going to create a few more cuts just to break it down. And swap those with the quotation key. Control B, intersect. Copy, undo, Control B, subtract. And now the 3rd layer set, and paste. And go back. Okay. And we're going to do another cut around right here. Accidentally moved it, so I'm just going to undo that. Okay, and just set that up, making sure that we're rotating, just give a little bit of variation, moving it around. Just want to get this bigger piece in here. Okay, and we'll flip those layers again. Shift B, intersect. Copy, undo, Shift B, subtract. And then back into our 3rd layer and paste that. We'll go back to our first set. And we'll go ahead and we'll just do one more cut on here, and then we're pretty much going to leave it, or we can go and do smaller cuts. Because this one's broken down so much, we can kind of blow it up a little bit differently than the rest. And we might even be able to just dissolve that out once everything else is kind of out of the way. And I'm going to break up that section right there. Alright, so we'll swap those layers. Shift B, intersect. And we don't really have to worry about those extra little polygons in there. I'm going to copy that, undo, Shift B, subtract, and go ahead and paste that onto that 3rd layer set. Okay, now we have the main planet kind of broken up. Still a little bit, few big chunks in here that are connected. But depending on where we're planning on animating them, we might, like I said, we might be able to just dissolve that out. But first I'm going to go ahead and activate all the layers with the cuts on it, and just take a look and see how it looks. And as you can see in the perspective view, it looks almost perfect. Still looks like a perfect circle. You will get a few little display errors popping up here and there. There's a little speck right there. And what that's going to do is affect our smoothing just a little bit. But that's why we have our original planet layer still saved, because in layout what we'll be doing is swapping them just before we start to explode the planet, and just so that our shadows will match up. And you can see a lot of geometry in here, but That's why we're keeping it, of course, on separate layers, because each piece will be animated separately. And it's a little time consuming that way, but we can be a little more precise than using the effects linker in layout. I'm going to save this, just hitting S on the keyboard if you haven't saved it already. And now I want to start breaking up this other small sections. So I'm going to take our cutting tool, and I have 2 extra pieces or layers designated for this, so that's 2 more pieces. So just go ahead and set up the cutting tool for that, and swap the layers, intersect, copy, undo, Shift B, subtract, and then paste that. And we'll take our cutting tool again, and move it into place, and rotate it a little. And I'll swap those layers again using the quotation key. Hit Shift and B, select intersect, copy that, undo that, Shift B again, subtract. And now we can paste that. And now we've broken that section up into 3 pieces. And pretty much what we'll be doing with these 3 separate pieces is we'll have this whole piece kind of shooting out during the explosion and then slowly breaking off each one of the larger pieces. And that's just for the main debris of the object. Just that we still have the shape of it breaking up, and it's not just a bunch of random debris. And like I said, it adds a lot more realism to the object when you're doing it like that. Alright, so the next piece we need to break up is this one right here. And I think we have, yes, 3 spots for that. So we're going to have to break that up into 4 pieces. And I've just designated those extra layers in there just by the size of the object, how much we want it broken up. Of course, that doesn't mean each piece has to be the same size. If anything, you'll want each piece to be different as much as possible, but not too different where you have one just gigantic piece and then a bunch of tiny pieces. You'll want to vary it a little. So we're going to take a small piece out of the side over here, swap the layers after setting up cutting tool, Shift B, select intersect, copy, undo, Shift B, subtract, and now we can paste that first piece in there. We'll set up our cutting tool again, making sure we have the right piece in the background, and we're going to take another little chunk out over here and swap those layers again, Shift B, select intersect, copy, undo, Shift B, subtract, paste that, and one last cut. Just going to move that into place, and we'll go ahead and swap those, Shift B, intersect, copy, undo, Shift B, subtract. And now we'll go ahead and paste that. And now we have that section broken up, where we have one large main section and then little pieces coming off of it, which I can show you the background. And that adds for a nice little variation in the object. And as you can see, we still have everything connected nicely. Okay, now we're going to need to move on to the next section. And that's this large piece right here, which we're going to break into 5 different pieces. And instead of switching back and forth between these layer sets right here, you can just go to, Window and Layers panel. And then what you can do, you could also name the layers at this point. We're not going to just yet. We can just kind of leave this up. Actually, we will name layer 2, and we'll just call it cut. And we're going to name layer 1 planet cut, and layer 3 planet main. And that way we know which is our cutting tool and which isn't. And we can go right here to our large piece, and then just go ahead and check mark in the B section right there for cut, and that way we get it in the background. And I could just cover it up there because we're mostly using keyboard shortcuts for everything. And I'll hit T on the keyboard, or actually, sorry. First we're gonna swap those layers so we have cut in the foreground, and go ahead and position that. And then we'll flip those layers again, Shift B, go to intersect, copy, undo, Shift B, subtract. And we're just going to go ahead and do that for the rest of the model. Doing the same method, just aligning our cutting tool and subtracting, or intersecting, and then copying, subtracting, and then pasting. Okay, I've finished cutting up all the pieces, and we now have a total of 30 different layers, and most of them are pieces for the planet broken up. As you can see in the wireframe, there's quite a bit of geometry in here. And actually, if you take a look in the wireframe perspective view, you can actually see where all the points are condensed and see exactly where the cuts are. It's kind of neat looking. Alright, I'm going to W on the keyboard. Just take a look at the statistics here. We have almost 18,000 points. And if we switch to polygon mode, you notice that we have almost 10,000 polygons. And the reason we have so many points compared to the polygons, normally there wouldn't be so many. It's mostly because we haven't merged anything. But to be honest, I don't want to merge anything. And in most cases, when you do a Boolean subtract, you're going to want to merge the points together. But if we were to do that, what it would actually do is really kind of mess up our look of the smoothing of the outside of our planet. And even though we are using object replacement, it'll look a little weird. As you can see, I just deleted over 7,000 points by merging, but I'm going to pull up the surface editor here and turn on smoothing. And you can see we do have a lot of these artifacts in here. But what it's also going to do is, if we have smoothing on for the cut as well, it'll kind of smooth with these other pieces of the planet. And now if you take a look with smoothing on the cut piece, we get a lot of unwanted looking geometry, and all of these strange looking polygon artifacts are all caused by smoothing, and if we don't merge the points together, we won't get that. So pull up our surface editor just to make sure it didn't just turn off the smoothing, and now we have everything unmerged, and we don't have to worry about those major strange looking artifacts that we had in there. Okay, we do have a few things here and there. As you can see, there's a little bit of distortion and little bits and pieces, but overall it's really not that bad. Not as bad as it would have been if we would merge the points together. And most of this will actually be taken care of with the texture that we're going to do in layout, and the rest of that we can just take care of by using our object replacement. And we'll just have that coming in and stay in the scene up until the point of the explosion. I'm going to hit S on the keyboard to save this, and now we can go ahead and put this into layout and start working on the texture.